The most chaotic, violent show on television was specifically designed to put you to sleep. And somehow, that's exactly what's going to happen tonight. The Boys is one of those rare shows that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it looks like a superhero story, but underneath it's a sharp, biting piece of social commentary wrapped in some of the most outrageous television ever produced. And the more you dig into the details, the more fascinating it becomes. So let's start at the very beginning, with the origins of the whole thing. The show is based on a comic book series written by Garth Ennis and illustrated by Derek Robertson. The comics were actually so controversial and so dark that DC Comics originally dropped the series before it even really got going. They decided the content was just too extreme for their imprint. The series eventually found a home with Dynamite Entertainment and ran for 72 issues. Now here's what's interesting about that. When the show was eventually developed for Amazon Prime Video, the showrunner Eric Kripke, who you might know from creating Supernatural, made it very clear early on that the show would not be a direct copy of the comics. They would take the spirit, the themes, the characters, and the general shape of the story, but they would tell it in their own way. And that approach turned out to be one of the smartest decisions anyone made in the entire production. Now as you're lying there starting to relax, let's talk about the names in this show, because the naming conventions are actually really clever and worth thinking about as you drift. Vought International, the corporation at the center of everything, is named after Friedrich Vought, a fictional Nazi scientist who supposedly created the original compound that gives soups their powers during World War II. That backstory gets explored more and more as the seasons progress, and it adds this genuinely unsettling historical weight to what could have just been a fun fictional evil corporation. Instead, it becomes something with actual roots, a lineage of awfulness that stretches back decades. There's real craft in that kind of world building, and it rewards viewers who pay attention. Speaking of world building, the show creates an entire fictional media landscape around Vought. There are fake movie trailers, fake news networks, fake merchandise, fake social media personalities for the superheroes. The level of detail that the production team puts into this parallel world is genuinely remarkable. There are actual functioning websites for Vought International, fake social media accounts for characters like Homelander and Starlight, and promotional materials that get released online to build hype before new seasons. It's one of the most immersive transmedia experiences any streaming show has ever created. And it works because it mirrors our actual world just closely enough to feel a little too real. Let's take a quiet moment and think about Homelander, because he is one of the most carefully constructed villains in recent television history. Anthony Starr, the actor who plays him, is actually from New Zealand. And he has spoken in various interviews about the psychological research he did to prepare for the role. Homelander is not just a powerful bad guy. He's a deeply traumatized individual who was essentially raised in a lab, denied genuine human connection, and turned into both a weapon and a product simultaneously. The team at the show worked to create a character who is terrifying but also, in very specific moments, genuinely pitiable. Not sympathetic in a way that excuses his actions, but pitiable in a way that makes you understand how someone becomes a monster. And here is something that's really interesting to hold on to as you relax. The show consistently explores this idea that fear and power interact in very specific ways. Characters who are visibly afraid of Homelander often end up in worse situations than characters who manage to hold their ground or show him genuine humanity. That's not just a plot mechanic. It's actually rooted in real psychology around dominance and submission dynamics. The writers clearly thought carefully about how power operates, not just in superhero stories, but in corporations, governments, and interpersonal relationships. That's the kind of intellectual depth that makes The Boys worth thinking about even when you're winding down. Now let's float over to talking about the cast, because there are some wonderful little facts here that you might find soothing to drift through. Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, kept his American accent throughout filming for the first several seasons, which is especially impressive given that Urban is a New Zealander. His natural accent is actually quite different from Butcher's specific British working-class voice, which itself required significant dialect work. So Urban was doing a British working-class accent while being a New Zealander working primarily in North America. That's 3 layers of performance just in the voice. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey Campbell, is the son of actors Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan. He actually modeled some of Huey's nervous energy and emotional accessibility on his own natural personality, describing himself as someone who genuinely feels things deeply and tends to show it. And it shows on screen, because Huey is one of the few characters in the entire show who consistently operates from a place of genuine moral feeling rather than pragmatism or self-interest. He's often wrong about how to act on that moral feeling, but the feeling itself is always real. That's what makes him such an effective anchor for the audience. As you settle deeper into comfort, let's talk about the title cards and episode naming conventions, because there's real thought here too. Episodes of The Boys are often titled after songs, album names, or cultural references that thematically connect to what happens in the story. The show uses these titles as a kind of secondary layer of meaning, a hint at the emotional register of what you're about to watch. For people who catch the references, there's an extra layer of satisfaction. For people who don't, the episodes still work perfectly on their own terms. That's good design. It works on multiple levels without requiring any particular prior knowledge. The production design of The Boys is something that deserves its own appreciation. The Seven's headquarters, the tower, the corporate spaces, all of that was designed to feel like the nightmare version of what you might imagine a superhero-themed corporation actually looking like. Sleek, expensive, deliberately intimidating. The production team drew on references from real corporate architecture, the kind of glass and steel aesthetic that major tech companies and financial firms use to project power and permanence. By putting superheroes in that specific visual context, the show immediately signals that this is not your typical superhero story. This is a story about what happens when power goes entirely unchecked. Let me drift us towards something a little more specific and fun. The Legend of the Legend character, played by Paul Racer, is designed as a nod to real figures from comic book history. In the comics, the character was conceived as a reference to legendary creators who built entire fictional universes and whose legacy became complicated over time. The show uses the character somewhat differently, as a kind of institutional memory for the world of Vought, someone who was there at the beginning and carries all that complicated history. Paul Racer brings a genuine warmth and world-weariness to the role that makes the character immediately compelling even without all the context. Something that's easy to miss but worth appreciating as you drift is how the show handles its supporting characters. Even minor characters who only appear in a handful of scenes tend to have coherent internal logic. They have things they want, things they're afraid of, reasons for their behavior that make sense within the world. That kind of consistency is extremely hard to maintain across a large ensemble cast over multiple seasons, and it speaks to a writer's room that takes its work seriously even when the content on screen is absolutely ridiculous. Now let's think about the physical production of the show for a moment, because it was filmed primarily in Toronto, Canada, with occasional location shoots elsewhere. Toronto is one of the great filming cities in the world precisely because it can convincingly double for so many different American environments depending on how you shoot it. The production team was skilled at using the city's varied architecture to create different feels for different parts of the fictional world. The corporate Vought spaces feel different from the street-level neighborhoods where Butcher and his crew operate, and that visual distinction is part of how the show maintains its thematic contrasts. Take a slow breath in and out. Let's talk about the soundtrack choices on the show, because they're frequently surprising and always intentional. The music supervisors have a talent for selecting songs that create ironic contrast with what's happening on screen. Extremely violent or disturbing sequences are sometimes scored with cheerful or nostalgic music, and that juxtaposition does something interesting to your experience as a viewer. It creates a kind of cognitive dissonance that reflects the show's central theme, that the most dangerous things often come packaged in the most appealing containers. Superheroes look like heroes. They're branded, marketed, beloved. And yet, the show's writing team has talked about how they approach each season by first identifying what real-world dynamics they want to explore and then building the story around those dynamics. Rather than starting with plot mechanics and then imposing themes afterward, they start with the question of what they actually want to say. What aspect of power, media, celebrity, corporate behavior, or political manipulation do they want to examine this season? and then they build everything else around that core inquiry. That's a fundamentally different approach from how many television shows are written, and it helps explain why The Boys feels so coherent even when the individual episodes are wildly chaotic. As you sink a little deeper into relaxation, let's appreciate the show's approach to female characters, because it's worth noting. The show has consistently worked to give its female characters agency, complexity, and storylines that aren't just in service of the male characters' arcs. Characters like Starlight, Queen Maeve, Sage, and others are all fully realized people with their own motivations, their own histories, and their own relationships to power. Some of them make choices that are questionable or even terrible. But they're making those choices for their own reasons, not just to serve as props in someone else's story. That's harder to accomplish than it sounds, and the show does it consistently. The relationship between the show and its source material is genuinely interesting from a craft perspective. Kripke and his team knew that a straight adaptation of the comics would not work for mainstream television, both because of content limitations and because the comic-specific satirical targets were rooted in a particular cultural moment that had already passed. So they kept the architecture of the original but renovated everything inside, updating the targets, deepening the character work, and finding new ways to make the core satirical points land for a contemporary audience. It's a masterclass in adaptation as creative interpretation rather than literal translation. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let your jaw unclench. We're going to keep drifting through some of the quieter corners of this fascinating world. The decision to make Homelander an explicit parallel to certain real-world figures was a deliberate choice that the show has leaned into more heavily as the seasons have progressed. The writers have talked about how they're interested in the psychology of charisma, specifically how someone with genuine charisma can use it to get away with increasingly terrible behavior while maintaining a loyal following. Homelander's trajectory across the seasons is essentially a study in how that escalation works. Each season he goes a little further. Each season his followers rationalize a little harder. And the show asks you to sit with the discomfort of recognizing those patterns from the real world. The Compound V mythology in the show is another area where the writers did careful, detailed thinking. The idea that superhero powers come from a pharmaceutical product developed by a corporation means that powers are not inherently heroic. They are manufactured. They are commodified. They are controlled. The corporation decides who gets them, under what conditions, with what restrictions. And that shifts the entire moral landscape of the story in ways that the show keeps exploring from new angles. What does it mean to have power that belongs to someone else? What do you owe them in return? And what happens when you decide you owe them nothing? We are somewhere past the midpoint of our journey now, and you might be feeling that lovely heavy relaxed sensation starting to settle in. Let's keep the thoughts soft and interesting. The character of Mother's Milk, played by Laz Alonso, is one of the show's most thoughtful additions to the story from the original comics. The television version of the character has a much more developed personal life, with family relationships and a specific history with Vought that gives his involvement in the boys' mission a personal dimension beyond just general opposition to corporate superheroism. That kind of specificity is what turns a functional plot character into someone you actually care about. And caring about the characters is what makes the show's darker moments hit as hard as they do. The costume design across the show also reflects the satirical intelligence at work throughout. The Seven's costumes are designed to look like premium branded merchandise, which is exactly what they are in the world of the show. They're commercially designed, focus grouped, optimized for merchandising and media presence. There's nothing organic or personal about them. Contrast that with the more worn, practical aesthetic of Butcher and the Boys, and the visual language immediately tells you something true about where both groups are coming from. One side is performing. The other side, whatever their flaws, is at least being real about what they're doing. Frenchie's character, played by Tomer Capone, has one of the more interesting emotional arcs across the seasons. He carries a significant amount of guilt from his past, guilt that the show slowly unpacks over time, and his relationships with other team members are colored by that guilt in ways that aren't always immediately obvious. Capone has talked about how he approached the character as someone who uses humor and performance as a defense mechanism, keeping people at a specific distance while simultaneously craving genuine connection. That's a very specific and very human psychological profile, and the show gives him enough space to actually explore it. The show's approach to humor is worth appreciating as you let your thoughts drift and slow. The comedy in The Boys is often extremely dark, but it's not mean-spirited in a simple way. The show tends to aim its harshest satirical energy upward, at the powerful and the corrupt and the hypocritical, rather than downward at the vulnerable. The people who get the sharpest treatment are almost always people who deserve it. And within the chaos and darkness, the show also finds moments of genuine warmth and even tenderness between characters who care about each other. Those moments of genuine human connection are what give the darker stuff its weight. Kimiko's character, played by Karen Fukuhara, operates largely without dialogue for significant portions of the earlier seasons, communicating primarily through physicality and expression. Fukuhara has spoken about how she worked with the production team to develop a full internal emotional life for Kimiko even in scenes where she has nothing to say. The result is a character who communicates volumes without words, which is actually a very difficult performance skill. Every fight sequence Kimiko is in is also choreographed to reflect her specific character rather than just generic action choreography. The way she moves tells you who she is. Let the thoughts come slower now. Let them float rather than race. One of the things that makes The Boys genuinely distinctive in the landscape of prestige television is its willingness to be genuinely uncomfortable. Not just edgy or provocative for attention, but actually uncomfortable in ways that make you think about your own relationship with the things being satirized. How much of your media consumption is driven by parasocial attachment to celebrity rather than actual values alignment? How often do you accept the branding of something rather than looking at what's underneath it? The show keeps asking those questions, not by putting them into dialogue, but by making you feel the discomfort of the answer. The visual effects work on the show has consistently punched above what you might expect for a television production. The team uses a combination of practical effects, stunt work, and digital effects, and they blend them in ways that keep the action feeling grounded even when the things happening are completely impossible. That groundedness is important because it keeps the characters feeling like people rather than cartoon figures. And when the characters feel like people, the story can actually mean something. Ashley's character arc across the seasons is one of the more quietly interesting threads in the whole show. She starts as a corporate functionary, someone who has genuinely sacrificed her better instincts in service of institutional advancement. And she stays in that compromised position through sheer determined avoidance of anything that might get her noticed or eliminated. There's something both comic and genuinely sad about a character whose primary survival strategy is to become as invisible and inoffensive as possible while surrounded by chaos. And the show is smart enough to acknowledge both dimensions without letting either overwhelm the other. Your breathing is probably slower now. Your body heavier. This is a good place to be. The show's satirical targets have shifted slightly from season to season as the real-world context has evolved. What started primarily as a satire of superhero media and corporate power has expanded to include social media dynamics, political demagoguery, religious institutions, and the psychology of movements built around charismatic but deeply flawed leaders. The writers have proven consistently willing to follow the thematic logic wherever it leads rather than staying in a comfortable lane. That's riskier, and it occasionally means the show overreaches, but it also means it stays genuinely engaged with the world rather than just recycling the same observations. Soulja Boy's character, played by Jensen Ackles, was a significant addition to the later seasons. Ackles, who had worked with Kripke on Supernatural, brought a specific kind of effortless charisma to the role that serves the character perfectly. Soulja Boy is supposed to feel like a certain era's idea of heroism, confident, physical, unreflective, deeply rooted in a set of values that look romantic from a distance and deeply problematic up close. Ackles plays all of that in a performance that's funny and disturbing in roughly equal measure, which is exactly the balance the show was going for. The show's depiction of media dynamics is one of its most consistently sharp satirical elements. Vought functions like a media company as much as anything else, because its superheroes are intellectual properties as much as they are people. They are brands. Their public images are managed with the same ruthless professionalism that any corporation would apply to its most valuable assets. And the show keeps returning to the gap between that carefully managed image and the reality underneath. That gap is where the horror lives. And also, frequently, where the comedy lives. As you settle towards sleep, hold on to this last thought. The Boys is ultimately a show about accountability, specifically what happens when accountability fails, when power goes unchecked, when the systems designed to keep the powerful honest are captured by the powerful themselves. And what it asks is whether ordinary people with ordinary resources and deeply imperfect characters can find ways to hold on to something true in that environment. It doesn't always give optimistic answers, but it takes the question seriously. And that seriousness, underneath all the chaos and the outrageous spectacle, is what makes it matter. Let your thoughts drift now like the quietest possible version of this enormous chaotic world. Just the interesting ideas floating by without weight or urgency. The craft that went into building it. The care that went into the characters. The intelligence underneath the madness. Let all of it carry you gently down into a deep and restful sleep. You've earned it. Good night. Before Carl Urban ever said a single word as Billy Butcher, the showrunner behind Supernatural sat down and made a quiet decision that would change how millions of people think about superheroes forever. The Boys premiered on Amazon Prime Video on July 26, 2019. The first season dropped all 8 episodes at once, which was a deliberate choice. The creators wanted viewers to experience the story as one continuous journey rather than waiting week to week. It was a binge-first design, and it worked. The show immediately captured millions of viewers and sparked conversations that spread across every corner of the internet. But long before anyone watched a single frame of that show, it existed as a comic book. Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson created The Boys as a comic series that ran from 2006 to 2012. The source material was even more extreme than what made it to television. Showrunner Eric Kripke, who you might know from creating Supernatural, took the comic and carefully shaped it into something that could work as a prestige streaming drama without losing its sharp satirical edge. That balancing act was one of the most interesting creative challenges the production team faced. Eric Kripke has spoken openly about how the show functions primarily as political and social satire. The superheroes in the world of The Boys are not noble protectors. They are corporate products managed by a company called Vought International. Everything about them, their image, their merchandise, their public appearances, is manufactured and controlled. Kripke wanted to use that fictional world as a mirror held up to real celebrity culture, corporate power, and media manipulation. The result was something that felt uncomfortably familiar. Let's talk about the casting process because it was genuinely fascinating. Carl Urban, the actor who plays Billy Butcher, the fierce and relentless leader of The Boys, was not the first person considered for the role. The character is described as having a very specific energy, a coiled tension beneath every word, a volcanic anger always threatening to erupt. Urban brought something irreplaceable to that character. His performance is layered with pain and conviction in a way that made audiences deeply invested in a person who is objectively doing morally questionable things. Urban himself prepared for the role by leaning into the character's backstory, particularly the traumatic loss that drives Butcher's obsession with superheroes. That grief is what makes Butcher understandable even when he's not sympathetic. It's one of the more sophisticated character constructions in the first season. Now here's something that might surprise you. Anthony Starr, who plays Homelander, the show's primary antagonist, is actually from New Zealand. His natural accent is nothing like the polished, all-American voice he uses as Homelander. Starr worked extensively with a dialect coach to perfect that voice, because Homelander needed to sound like the idealized version of American heroism, the kind of voice that reads as trustworthy and wholesome even when everything else about the character is deeply wrong. Anthony Starr has described Homelander as one of the most challenging roles he has ever taken on. Not physically, but psychologically. Playing a character who is simultaneously terrifying and deeply pathetic, who craves approval while also being capable of casual cruelty, required a very specific kind of internal work. Starr has mentioned in interviews that he had to find genuine sympathy for Homelander in order to play him truthfully. He had to understand the character's emotional deprivation and loneliness without excusing any of the monstrous behavior. The writing team spent considerable time developing Homelander's psychological profile. They drew on concepts related to narcissistic personality disorder and what happens when a person grows up completely isolated from genuine human connection. Homelander was raised in a laboratory environment. He never experienced normal childhood bonds. That backstory, revealed gradually through the first season, reframes him from a simple villain into something more tragic and disturbing. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey Campbell, the emotional center of the show, is the son of actor Dennis Quaid and singer Meg Ryan. He grew up in a household with significant Hollywood experience around him, but he pursued his own path methodically. The Huey character is the audience's entry point into this world. When the series begins, Huey is an ordinary young man working a simple job and navigating a comfortable, if somewhat stagnant, relationship. His world gets destroyed in the very first episode in an incident involving a superhero that is simultaneously shocking and darkly comedic. The creators made a deliberate choice to anchor the show through Huey's perspective precisely because he starts from a place of genuine innocence. He has no agenda. He has no mission. He is simply someone who has been catastrophically wronged by a system that protects the powerful and discards ordinary people. Watching him evolve across the first season from heartbroken bystander to active participant in something morally complicated is one of the most satisfying character arcs in the entire run. Erin Moriarty plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, and her storyline in Season 1 is perhaps the most emotionally resonant of all the characters on the superhero side of the story. Annie begins the season achieving her lifelong dream of joining the Seven, the show's version of a premier superhero team. Within her first hours as a member, that dream begins to crumble as she discovers the reality behind the institution she idolized. The show uses Annie's story to explore themes around exploitation, the corruption of idealism, and the experience of speaking up about wrongdoing in environments that punish honesty. Moriarty has spoken about how meaningful those themes were to her personally, and how she wanted to honor the authenticity of what the character was experiencing. Her performance throughout Season 1 walks a careful line between vulnerability and strength that accumulates real emotional power by the finale. Let's slow down for a moment. If you're drifting, that's perfectly fine. Let these facts just float through your mind gently. There's no urgency here. Just interesting details about a fascinating show, delivered at a comfortable pace. Take another slow breath. Let your muscles relax a little more. The production design of The Boys is worth discussing because it's a significant part of what makes the show feel grounded and real despite its fantastical premise. The design team made very deliberate choices about how superheroes would dress, move through public spaces, and interact with corporate environments. The Seven's headquarters was designed to feel like a combination of a tech company campus and a luxury hotel. Everything is sleek and impressive on the surface, with an underlying sterility that suggests something is very wrong beneath the polished exterior. The costumes for the Seven required months of development. Homelander's suit in particular was engineered to communicate specific things about the character. The American flag imagery is obvious, but the details of how the suit fits, how it moves, and how it photographs under different lighting conditions were all carefully calibrated. The costume designers wanted it to look genuinely impressive at a distance while also feeling slightly wrong up close, almost too perfect, like a mannequin come to life. The show filmed primarily in Toronto, Canada, which might be surprising given how thoroughly American the setting feels. Toronto has become a major production hub for American film and television, and the city has many locations that can convincingly stand in for various American urban environments. The production team worked hard to ensure that nothing felt obviously Canadian, carefully controlling background details, signage, and architectural elements that might break the illusion. One of the more technically impressive sequences in the first season involves a speedboat on the Hudson River that intersects with a whale. This scene required an enormous amount of coordination between practical effects and digital effects teams. The sequence is one of the show's most memorably absurd and shocking moments, and creating it involved challenges around how to make the digital elements feel physically real and weighty rather than obviously computer-generated. The effects team has spoken about the complexity of that particular sequence and how proud they were of the final result. The show's approach to violence was a conscious artistic and thematic choice. The violence in The Boys is not stylized or made to look cool. It is almost always visceral, consequential, and uncomfortable to watch. This was deliberate. The creators wanted to reject the tradition of superhero films and television shows where violence happens without lasting physical or emotional consequences. In The Boys, things break and people do not simply recover. That approach reinforces the show's central argument about how we glamorize power and ignore its costs. The music choices throughout Season 1 are also worth appreciating. The show uses familiar popular songs in moments where the contrast between the cheerful music and the disturbing events on screen creates an unsettling effect. This technique has roots in the tradition of films like A Clockwork Orange and Reservoir Dogs, where the juxtaposition of upbeat music with dark content forces the audience to examine their own emotional responses. The Boys uses this tool with precision. Now let's talk about some of the smaller details that dedicated viewers discovered. The fictional brand of Vought International is embedded throughout the world of the show in ways that casual viewers might miss. There are Vought advertisements in the background of scenes. Vought products appear on shelves. The company's influence is visible in every corner of the world these characters inhabit, which reinforces the idea that Vought is not just a powerful company but a totalizing presence in the culture of this fictional America. The show also includes many satirical references to real-world corporate and political behavior. When Vought executives discuss strategy, their conversations echo actual discussions that happen in boardrooms around marketing, crisis management, and the protection of brand value. When politicians in the show debate whether superheroes should be incorporated into the military, the arguments mirror actual debates about corporate power and the relationship between private entities and government functions. These parallels are entirely intentional. Elizabeth Shue plays Madeline Stillwell, a senior Vought executive who manages Homelander among other heroes. Her performance is fascinating because she plays a character who is completely comfortable with moral corruption while maintaining a surface warmth and professionalism. Stillwell is one of the more chilling figures in the first season because she never seems frightened by what she knows about the people she manages. The dynamic between Stillwell and Homelander is one of the first season's most psychologically interesting relationships. Chase Crawford plays the Deep, a member of the Seven whose storyline in Season 1 functions as both satire and a surprisingly earnest exploration of accountability. The Deep believes himself to be a significant and respected figure. The reality is more complicated. Crawford has spoken about how he appreciated the writers giving the character genuine consequences for his actions, while also allowing space for the audience to understand how someone could be simultaneously culpable and limited in their self-awareness. Laz Alonso plays Mother's Milk, a member of the Boys whose grounded pragmatism makes him one of the most watchable characters in the ensemble. The character has a family, a wife and daughter, which immediately raises the emotional stakes around his involvement in the dangerous work the Boys are doing. Alonso has discussed how important it was to him that Mother's Milk not be reduced to a one-dimensional tough guy, that the family element be taken seriously and used to illuminate the real costs of the life he is leading. Karen Fukuhara plays Kimiko, a character who is introduced under circumstances that make her appear dangerous and unpredictable. Her arc across the first season is one of quiet revelation. As audiences learn more about where she came from and what was done to her, the character shifts from a threat to someone who is herself a victim of the same system the Boys are fighting against. Fukuhara has spoken about how she worked to communicate Kimiko's inner life entirely through physical performance, since the character does not speak, and how liberating and challenging that constraint was. Toma Capone plays Frenchie, a member of the Boys whose backstory involves a complicated personal history with crime and moral failure. Frenchie's relationship with Kimiko becomes one of the emotional cores of the show, and the development of that connection across the first season is handled with more delicacy and care than you might expect from a show with this reputation for intensity. Let the details settle around you like something soft and warm. You don't need to hold onto every word. Just let them drift by. The facts are interesting. The stories are real. And there's nothing you need to do right now except breathe slowly and let yourself be still. The showrunners have discussed how the first season was deliberately structured to escalate in a specific way. The opening episodes establish the world and introduce the central characters. The middle episodes deepen the stakes and complicate the moral landscape. The final episodes push every character to a point where they cannot return to where they started. This three-act structure is applied both to the season as a whole and to individual episodes. One of the creative decisions that had the biggest impact on how audiences received the show was the choice to make the boys themselves morally compromised. These are not simply heroic rebels fighting an evil system. They use deception, manipulation, and violence. Billy Butcher makes choices throughout the first season that are difficult to defend. The audience is asked to root for people who are themselves capable of serious wrongdoing, which creates a more honest and uncomfortable viewing experience than most superhero narratives offer. The relationship between Butcher and Huey is one of the most carefully developed dynamics in Season 1. Butcher sees Huey as useful and recruits him for that reason. But as the season progresses, something more complex develops between them. There is a paternalistic affection that Butcher has difficulty acknowledging, and a hero worship in Huey that gradually gives way to a more clear-eyed and troubled understanding of who Butcher actually is. By the end of the season, the relationship has been tested in ways that neither character could have anticipated. The finale of Season 1, the 8th episode, delivers several significant revelations and shifts the emotional landscape of nearly every major storyline. Without dwelling on specific plot details in a way that might feel too stimulating for sleep, it's worth noting that the writers made sure every character ends the season in a fundamentally different place than where they began. This is good storytelling discipline. Every journey should cost something and change the traveler. Let's take a slower moment. Think about how warm and comfortable you are right now. The details of the show can just wash over you gently. There's no test, no reason to stay sharp. Just interesting things to think about as your mind gets quieter and quieter. The ratings and reception that The Boys received after its premiere were exceptional for an original streaming series. Critics praised its willingness to be genuinely provocative rather than provocative in a safe and calculated way. Audiences responded to the feeling that the show trusted them to handle complicated ideas and morally ambiguous characters without being given easy answers. The show earned multiple award nominations from various industry bodies following its first season. Anthony Starr received particular attention for his work as Homelander, with many critics noting that the character could easily have become cartoonish but instead became genuinely unsettling because of the specificity and humanity Starr brought to the performance. There was a significant amount of thought put into how Vaught's superheroes would be presented as celebrities. The creative team studied real celebrity media coverage extensively to understand how publicity machines work, how carefully constructed images are built and maintained, and how scandals are managed or suppressed. The result is a fictional celebrity culture that feels immediately recognizable because it is based so closely on real patterns of behavior. The show's satirical targets in Season 1 include media consolidation, pharmaceutical companies, the military-industrial complex, organized religion, and the entertainment industry. Each of these targets is embedded in the world of the show not through monologues or editorial moments but through the texture of how the world operates. Characters live inside these systems. The critique emerges from the story itself rather than being stated explicitly. One detail that many viewers found interesting is the way the show portrays the relationship between superheroes and religion. Annie comes from a religious background and has connected her faith to her identity as a hero. The show treats this with more nuance than you might expect, exploring how institutions can co-opt genuine belief for purposes that have nothing to do with the spiritual values at the heart of that belief. The production budget for the first season of The Boys was substantial, reflecting Amazon's commitment to competing with other premium streaming services by investing in genuinely cinematic productions. The money is visible on screen in the quality of the effects work, the production design, and the ability to shoot in multiple locations with large casts and complex sequences. The sound design of the show deserves recognition as well. The way certain scenes are constructed orally, with precise control of ambient sound and music, creates an atmosphere that reinforces the emotional content of what is happening visually. The sound team worked to ensure that the show's quieter moments felt as carefully crafted as its most explosive sequences. Let the quiet of right now be something pleasant. Your breathing is probably slower than it was when we started. Your thoughts are probably less sharp. This is exactly where you want to be. There's still a little more to hear, so let it come gently. The boys developed a passionate fan community very quickly after its premiere. Viewers created detailed analyses of the show's political subtext, character psychology, and narrative structure. Fan communities across multiple platforms generated discussion, fan art, theories, and creative work inspired by the show. This level of engagement is something the creators have spoken about with genuine appreciation, noting that the show sparked exactly the kind of conversation they hoped it would. Eric Kripke has been active in communicating with the audience about the show's intentions and themes. He has consistently framed the series as a work of satire that invites audiences to examine their own relationship with power, celebrity, and the stories we tell about what makes someone heroic. That clarity of artistic intention is part of what gives the show its coherence and impact. One of the more interesting technical aspects of the first season is how the directors handled the visual presentation of superpowers. The decision was made to ground the superhero action as much as possible in practical reality, rather than leaning into the spectacular visual glamour of big-budget superhero films. Powers are shown with a focus on physical cause and effect, on weight and mass and consequence, rather than as sources of cinematic wonder. This approach is another expression of the show's central thesis about demystifying power. The writing room for the first season was diverse in terms of perspective and background, which contributed to the range of angles from which the show examines its themes. Multiple writers brought different life experiences and areas of expertise to the development of storylines and characters, which is visible in the texture and specificity of the world the show creates. The show manages something genuinely difficult, which is being simultaneously funny and disturbing. Many scenes operate on both registers at once, which requires extraordinary precision in the writing, directing, and performance. The comedy never undermines the emotional reality of what is happening. The darkness never completely overwhelms the show's sense of absurdity. Maintaining that balance across 8 episodes of a first season is a real achievement. You might be feeling very comfortable right now. Maybe your eyes feel heavy, or your thoughts are starting to move more slowly. That's a perfectly natural place to be. There is no hurry. The show's details will still be here in the morning if you want to think about them again. For now, let them just be soft background texture as your mind moves toward rest. The boys of the title, the core group that Billy Butcher assembles, each bring something different to the team's dynamic. Butcher provides drive and ruthlessness. Huey provides moral perspective and emotional grounding. Mother's Milk provides discipline and structure. Frenchie provides expertise and an unexpected warmth. Kimiko provides capability and a kind of silent moral clarity. Together, they function as a counter-institution to Vought, fighting corporate power with improvisation and desperation. The Seven, Vaught's premier team, mirror and contrast the boys in interesting ways. Where the boys are held together by complicated personal loyalty, the Seven are held together by contract and performance. Where the boys are honest about what they are even when that honesty is uncomfortable, the Seven maintain a constant fiction about what they represent. This structural contrast is one of the show's most elegant organizational choices. The show ends its first season having established a world that is richly detailed, thematically coherent, and populated by characters whose futures remain genuinely uncertain. The choices made in those 8 episodes set up everything that would follow while also functioning as a complete story with its own beginning, middle, and resolution. For a show that arrived with the expectation of being provocative and extreme, The Boys Season 1 surprised many viewers with how emotionally engaged it made them. The satirical framework never prevented genuine feeling from emerging. The dark comedy never kept the dramatic stakes from feeling real. The political commentary never reduced the characters to mouthpieces. All of these elements coexisted because the creative team never lost sight of the human stories at the center of everything. Everything you've heard tonight is just a small selection from the full depth of interesting details available about this show. There are stories about specific production challenges, about lines that almost didn't make it into the final cut, about performances that surprised even the directors, about moments where the shoot went unexpectedly and something better emerged from the improvisation. Stories have layers, and this particular story has many. But that's all for now. Your breathing is slower. The words are coming more softly now. The day has been whatever it was, and now it's over, and you are warm and still in this moment, with nothing particular you need to do or think about. The interesting facts about the boys will keep. They'll be right there if you want to revisit them tomorrow. What matters right now is that you are comfortable, that your mind is gently occupied but not stimulated, that the world outside has gotten very quiet, and that the only thing you're asked to do in this moment is allow yourself to let go. The boys will be there. Season 1 will be exactly as it was. Butcher and Huey and Annie and all of the others will be right where you left them. None of it is going anywhere. And neither are you. You're right here, steady and still, and sleep is very close now, just at the edges of your awareness, warm and patient, waiting for you to stop holding on and simply fall into it. Drift down. Let go. Close whatever is left that's open. You've done well today. You've made it to this quiet place. And now there is nothing left to do except rest. Good night. Here's a gentle drift into something your brain can actually enjoy tonight. Jensen Ackles spent 15 years being one of TV's most beloved heroes. Then his old boss hired him to destroy that entire image, and the result broke the internet in 2022. The Boys first appeared on Amazon Prime Video back in 2019, and it immediately carved out its own unique space in the superhero genre. By the time Season 3 arrived in June of 2022, the show had become a full-blown cultural phenomenon. Season 3 pushed things even further than anyone expected, diving deeper into the politics, the satire, the violence, and the character development that fans had come to love. But there's so much more to this season than what you see on screen. The stories behind the stories are just as compelling as the show itself, and tonight we are going to walk through all of them at a pace that's perfect for winding down and drifting off. Let's start with the most talked about element of Season 3, which is the introduction of Herogasm. Now, even if you haven't seen the show, you've probably heard people mention this episode. Herogasm is originally a storyline from the comic books written by Garth Ennis, and for years fans wondered whether the show would ever actually adapt it. When showrunner Eric Kripke and his team finally decided to go for it, they committed completely. The episode titled Herogasm became one of the most discussed and dissected episodes of television in 2022. What's genuinely fascinating is that the production team made a very deliberate and thoughtful decision to approach the content in a way that felt purposeful rather than gratuitous. Kripke talked openly about how they wanted the scene to serve the story and the characters rather than exist purely for shock value. The Homelander versus Soldier Boy versus Butcher confrontation that takes place during that episode is genuinely one of the most intense fight sequences the show has ever produced. Speaking of Soldier Boy, the casting of Jensen Ackles in that role deserves its own conversation. Jensen Ackles spent 15 years playing Dean Winchester on Supernatural, a show that Eric Kripke himself created. So when it came time to cast Soldier Boy, a character who is essentially a toxic, narcissistic, deeply dangerous version of a classic American superhero, Kripke knew exactly who he wanted. There's something beautifully layered about taking an actor who became famous for playing a beloved hero and giving him a role that systematically deconstructs the very idea of heroism. Jensen Ackles threw himself into the part with remarkable dedication. He spent months preparing physically and vocally to embody the character, and the result is a performance that manages to be simultaneously magnetic and genuinely unsettling. The character of Soldier Boy is deeply rooted in American mythology. He's presented as the original superhero, a figure from World War II who became a symbol of American power and exceptionalism. But as Season 3 reveals, almost everything about his legendary status is manufactured. The show uses him as a way to comment on how societies construct heroes, and how those constructions often have nothing to do with the actual people they supposedly represent. Soldier Boy didn't earn his reputation through genuine heroism. He earned it through propaganda, through corporate storytelling, and through the willingness of powerful institutions to promote a useful image regardless of the truth. That's a theme that runs through the entire show, but Season 3 makes it more explicit and more personal than ever before. Now let's talk about the research and development that goes into making this season feel so textured and real despite all its over-the-top elements. The writer's room for The Boys is known for doing extensive research into corporate culture, political messaging, social media dynamics, and the history of celebrity. For Season 3, they dug particularly deep into the mechanics of fascism, propaganda, and the psychology of charismatic authoritarian figures. The way Homelander's arc develops throughout the season is clearly informed by real-world examples of populist leaders who cultivate devoted followings through emotional manipulation and the constant performance of victimhood. Anthony Starr, who plays Homelander, has spoken in interviews about how he studied various historical and contemporary figures to understand the psychological makeup of someone like that. Anthony Starr's performance in Season 3 is widely considered to be one of the finest acting achievements in the entire run of the show. He finds new layers in Homelander that feel genuinely surprising even for viewers who thought they understood the character completely. The scene where Homelander stands on top of a building and is cheered by a crowd after committing an act of open violence is one of the most disturbing and thought-provoking moments in the season. It's disturbing precisely because it feels believable. It doesn't feel like science fiction or exaggeration. It feels like a logical extension of things we've actually seen happen in the real world. The writers and Starr worked very carefully together to build that moment properly across multiple episodes so that when it lands, it hits with maximum impact. Now let's drift a little softer, because we're talking about sleep content here and I want to make sure you're settling in nicely. Just take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. The facts we are discussing are interesting, but there's no urgency here. Just let the information float around you gently as you get more comfortable. The production design of Season 3 is extraordinary, and it's something that often gets overlooked in favor of discussing the performances and the storylines. The visual language of the show evolved significantly this season. The Seven's boardroom, Vought Tower, the various locations tied to the history of Compound V, all of these spaces were designed with incredible attention to detail. The art department embedded visual references and symbolic imagery throughout the season that reward close attention. If you've ever paused on certain frames and noticed something unexpected in the background, that's completely intentional. The production designers have talked about how they treat the visual world of The Boys like a layer of storytelling that exists independent of the dialogue and action. The costumes in Season 3 are another area where an enormous amount of thought went into every decision. The superhero suits are obviously spectacular and technically demanding, but the civilian clothing is where the costume department gets to do some of their most interesting character work. The way Billy Butcher dresses, for instance, tells you a huge amount about his psychology and his sense of self. The way Homelander's costume has evolved subtly across the seasons reflects his character arc. These aren't accidents. The costume designers work closely with the writers and directors to make sure that what characters wear is reinforcing what the scripts and performances are communicating. Let's talk about the comedy in Season 3 for a moment, because this show does something genuinely difficult, which is balance brutal violence and heavy thematic content with genuinely funny humor. The character of Frenchie, played by Toma Capone, and the character of Kimiko, played by Karen Fukuhara, got a musical number in Season 3 that became one of the most beloved and unexpected moments in the show's history. The sequence, set to a well-known song, is completely absurd and completely charming, and it works because the show has earned the emotional investment in these two characters over multiple seasons. You care about Frenchie and Kimiko deeply by the time that moment arrives, so when it happens, it genuinely delights you rather than feeling like a tonal mistake. Karen Fukuhara has spoken about how much preparation went into that sequence and how meaningful it was for her character's arc. Kimiko is a character who was robbed of her voice in a very literal sense, and the musical number is a fantasy sequence that represents her inner life in a way that the show hadn't been able to access before. It's a genuinely creative storytelling choice that shows the depth of commitment the writers have to every character in the ensemble, not just the headliners. The relationship between Butcher and Huey in Season 3 undergoes some of its most significant development yet. Carl Urban and Jack Quaid have remarkable chemistry that has been one of the show's secret weapons since the beginning, but this season their dynamic gets genuinely complicated in ways that feel emotionally honest. Both characters make choices that are hard to justify and hard to forgive, and the show doesn't ask you to simply understand or excuse those choices. It asks you to sit with the complexity and keep watching. That's a mature approach to storytelling that respects the audience's intelligence and emotional capacity. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey, is the son of Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan, which is a piece of trivia that never stops being interesting. He came to The Boys as a relatively unknown actor and has used the show as a platform to develop into someone with genuine range and presence. His journey in Season 3 involves experimenting with Compound V to gain temporary powers, and the show uses that storyline to explore questions about masculinity, self-worth, and the dangerous seductiveness of power. Huey wants to feel capable and relevant and strong, and the show is compassionate about that desire while also being clear-eyed about the costs of pursuing power through shortcuts. Now let's ease back a little more. You've been listening for a while now, and hopefully your body is getting heavier and your thoughts are starting to slow down. We are going to keep going, nice and steady, through more of these fascinating details. Just let the words carry you along without holding onto anything too tightly. One of the most technically impressive aspects of Season 3 is the action choreography and the visual effects work. The fight sequences in this season are more elaborate and more viscerally impactful than anything the show had done before. The confrontation at Harrigasm and the various battles involving Soldier Boy required months of pre-production planning and collaboration between the stunt team, the visual effects department, and the directors. The show works with a rotating group of directors rather than a single consistent voice, which is a model that requires exceptional coordination. Each director brings their own aesthetic sensibilities to their episodes, but the overall visual consistency is maintained through the work of the producers and the director of photography. The visual effects team on The Boys Season 3 did something genuinely interesting with Soldier Boy's power set. His ability, which involves releasing a powerful energy blast that can suppress other suits' powers, required building a whole new visual language that had to feel distinct from the other powers in the show while still fitting within the established aesthetic. The team drew inspiration from various sources including vintage comic book imagery and Cold War-era nuclear imagery to give his power a specific historical texture. Eric Kripke's role as showrunner deserves special attention because his vision and his voice are what give the show its particular character. Kripke is known for being deeply involved in every aspect of the creative process while also being genuinely collaborative with his writers, directors, and actors. He talks openly about the political intentions of the show and doesn't shy away from being specific about what he's responding to in contemporary culture. This willingness to be direct about the show's satirical targets is somewhat unusual in Hollywood, where projects are often packaged in ambiguity to avoid alienating any potential audience segment. Kripke has made a deliberate choice to be clear about what the boys are saying and to trust that the audience will be receptive to that kind of directness. The show's handling of social media and online celebrity culture in Season 3 is particularly sharp. A-Train's storyline this season involves themes of racial identity and the instrumentalization of social justice messaging for personal and corporate gain. This is a storyline that required careful and thoughtful handling, and the writers worked hard to make sure it felt genuinely considered rather than superficial. The show doesn't offer easy answers about A-Train or his choices. It presents the contradictions and lets the audience wrestle with them. Jesse T. Usher, who plays A-Train, has spoken about how much the storyline meant to him personally and how he worked closely with the writers to make sure the character's perspective felt authentic. The deep storyline in Season 3 continues to develop in directions that are equal parts comedic and genuinely uncomfortable. Chase Crawford plays the deep with a specific kind of pathetic energy that is really difficult to pull off without becoming cartoonish. The character is simultaneously a predator, a coward, a comic figure, and occasionally someone who seems capable of genuine feeling. The show uses him as a way to explore how institutions protect and enable bad actors, how sycophancy and ambition corrupt people, and how the desperate need for approval can lead someone to do things they might otherwise consider unconscionable. Let's talk about the Black Noir storyline in Season 3 because it goes to some surprising and genuinely poignant places. The character, who had been largely mysterious for the first 2 seasons, gets more interiority this season through flashback sequences that use an interesting stylistic choice involving cartoon characters to represent his inner life. This was a creative decision that could easily have felt gimmicky but instead lands with real emotional weight. The reveal of Black Noir's backstory and his relationship to Soldier Boy adds a new dimension to both characters that recontextualizes things you thought you already understood. Nathan Mitchell, who plays Black Noir, is a physically imposing presence who conveys enormous amounts of emotion through body language alone, which is genuinely demanding work given that the character almost never removes the mask. He has spoken about the challenges and the rewards of performing in a way that relies entirely on physical expression rather than facial expression, and Season 3 gave him some of his most demanding and rewarding material yet. As you're listening to this, hopefully your breathing has slowed down a little. The room is quiet around you. These details about the boys are interesting, but they don't require anything from you right now. You can just let them drift past, catching the ones that interest you, letting the others go. Season 3 of The Boys is 8 episodes long, which is a length that the production team has consistently used across all 3 seasons. This consistency is deliberate. Kripke has talked about his preference for tight, focused seasons that don't allow the narrative to become bloated or repetitive. Each episode in Season 3 runs roughly between 45 and 65 minutes, giving each installment room to breathe while maintaining momentum. The pacing within individual episodes is carefully controlled to balance action, character work, comedy, and thematic content in proportions that feel natural rather than mechanical. The music in The Boys Season 3 is another area where the show does exceptional work. The music supervisor makes choices that are surprising and specific rather than reaching for obvious or safe selections. The way songs are deployed in the show often creates meaning through contrast or irony, placing upbeat or familiar music against images and actions that create a dissonance that's both funny and unsettling. This technique has been used memorably across the entire series, but Season 3 finds new variations on it that feel fresh. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, which serves as a convincing stand-in for various American locations. The production team has become expert at transforming Toronto streets and architecture into environments that feel authentically American while taking advantage of Canadian production resources. This is a common practice in television and film production, but The Boys does it particularly effectively, and regular Toronto residents have noted the experience of recognizing local landmarks dressed up as fictional American locations. One of the most discussed aspects of Season 3 is its political satire, and the question of how directly the show is commenting on specific real-world figures and events. The showrunners and writers have been fairly open about their general targets without being so specific that the show becomes a series of one-to-one allegories. The genius of the satire is that it's specific enough to be pointed but broad enough to have resonance beyond any particular moment. This is actually harder to achieve than it sounds. Satire that's too specific becomes dated quickly. Satire that's too general loses its teeth. The Boys threads that needle with notable skill. The casting process for Season 3, particularly for Soldier Boy, involved extensive conversations about what the character needed to accomplish and what kind of actor could bring the necessary combination of physical presence, comedic timing, dramatic weight, and cultural meaning to the role. Jensen Ackles checks all of those boxes and then some. What's particularly interesting is that his character exists in a kind of generational dialogue with Homelander throughout the season. They're both products of Vaught's manufacturing process. They're both performers of a certain kind of American masculinity. But they come from different eras and different templates, and that generational gap between them is one of the richest dramatic tensions the season explores. The writers of The Boys have a background in various genres and traditions, and that diversity of influence shows in the texture of the writing. There are elements of horror, action cinema, political thriller, black comedy, and character drama all operating simultaneously. Managing all of those registers without any of them overwhelming the others is a genuine craft achievement, and Season 3 is probably the best example of the show operating at peak capacity across all of those modes at once. Let's take another gentle pause here. You're doing great. Just breathe. The night is quiet and still, and there's nothing you need to do right now except rest. Let these interesting facts about this fascinating show continue to drift over you as your mind becomes quieter. Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, has one of the most demanding arcs in Season 3. Her character is at the center of some of the season's most emotionally intense moments as she navigates her relationship with Huey, her position within the Seven, and her own evolving sense of identity and purpose. Moriarty has spoken about the physical and emotional demands of the season, and about working closely with the directors and writers to make sure Annie's journey felt internally consistent and emotionally real. Her performance is remarkable for its combination of warmth, vulnerability, and genuine ferocity. The show's approach to violence is something that comes up frequently in discussions about what The Boys is doing aesthetically and ethically. The violence in the show is graphic and it's meant to be uncomfortable. The creative team has been consistent in explaining that they want the violence to have weight and consequence rather than being the kind of bloodless, sanitized violence that dominates most superhero content. By making the violence feel real and costly, the show forces the audience to think about what they're watching in a way that's genuinely useful for the show's thematic purposes. You can't watch The Boys and find the violence entertaining in a simple, uncomplicated way. It always comes with a cost. The relationship between The Boys and the superhero genre more broadly is a genuinely complex one. The show clearly loves superhero stories even as it systematically deconstructs them. Many of the creators and cast members are fans of the genre who see The Boys as a way of engaging with it critically rather than dismissing it. There's a difference between hating something and caring enough about it to examine its assumptions and contradictions. The Boys falls firmly in the latter category, and that genuine engagement with the genre is part of what gives the show its energy and its affection. The production schedule for The Boys Season 3 was complicated by the ongoing effects of the global pandemic, which had disrupted production across the television and film industry. The team adapted to the challenges with considerable flexibility and creativity, and the final product shows no visible evidence of the difficulties they faced. This is a testament to the professionalism and dedication of everyone involved in the production, from the writers and directors to the crew members who made it happen on a practical level every single day. Let's talk for a moment about the fan response to Season 3, because it's genuinely interesting to observe how the audience engaged with the most provocative elements. The Harrigasm episode was watched and discussed by enormous numbers of people who had perhaps been casual fans before and became deeply invested viewers after experiencing what the show was willing to do. The internet response to that episode was a kind of cultural event in itself, with commentary coming from people across the entertainment industry, media, and general public. The showrunners had anticipated a strong reaction, but the scale of the conversation surprised even them. The show's use of social media as part of its promotional strategy has been particularly clever. The Vought International account, which presents itself as though it's the real social media presence of the fictional corporation from the show, has become a beloved part of the fan experience. The content posted on these accounts extends the world of the show into real social media spaces in a way that's both funny and thought-provoking, given that the show is partly about the power of social media and corporate messaging. It's the show practicing what it preaches in a way that demonstrates genuine self-awareness. The critical response to Season 3 was overwhelmingly positive, with particular praise directed at the performances, the writing, and the show's willingness to continue taking risks rather than settling into a comfortable formula. Shows that make it to a third season often become more cautious as they try to protect what they've built, but The Boys actually became more ambitious and more confident with each passing season. That's a pattern that's relatively rare in television, and it's worth noting as one of the show's significant achievements. One particularly interesting behind-the-scenes detail from Season 3 involves the writing of the Homelander storyline. The writers have described the process of mapping out his arc as requiring them to constantly think about real-world historical examples of how charismatic but dangerous figures build and maintain power. They read extensively in history and political science to understand the mechanics of what Homelander is doing, which is why his manipulation of public sentiment feels so disturbingly credible. Anthony Starr then took that research and grounded it in an incredibly specific, technically precise performance that never tips over into caricature. The Boys exists in a tradition of satirical fiction that includes everything from network to DR. Strangelove to Don't Look Up, works that use exaggeration and dark humor to illuminate uncomfortable truths about how power operates and how ordinary people respond to it. What makes The Boys distinctive within that tradition is the combination of its mainstream appeal, its superhero trappings, and its genuine emotional depth. It reaches people who might not normally engage with explicitly political satire because it wraps its arguments in an enormously entertaining package. You're still here, which is wonderful. Hopefully you're quite relaxed by now, maybe drifting a little. That's perfectly fine. Just let the last few details wash over you gently as we wind down this conversation about a show that has so much more going on beneath its spectacular surface. The character of Victoria Newman, played by Claudia Dumont, becomes even more important in Season 3 as her true allegiances and capabilities become clearer. The character is a brilliantly constructed piece of satire about political ambition and the way institutions protect people who are useful to them regardless of what those people have done. Dumont brings a specific kind of controlled intensity to the role that makes Newman consistently compelling even when the character is doing things that are difficult to watch. The show's writers have consistently said that they want the show to be genuinely funny as well as genuinely disturbing, and Season 3 achieves that balance probably better than any previous season. The comedy never undercuts the drama, and the drama never makes the comedy feel inappropriate. They exist simultaneously because that's how life actually works. The most intense and the most absurd things can occupy the same moment, and the ability to reflect that truth is one of the markers of genuinely sophisticated storytelling. As we draw close to the end of tonight's journey through the fascinating details of The Boys Season 3, I want to leave you with something to think about as you drift off into sleep. The show is ultimately about accountability and the absence of it. It's about what happens when power is allowed to operate without consequences, when the stories we tell about strength and heroism are manufactured rather than earned, and when ordinary people try to find ways to hold extraordinary power responsible. Those are questions that have always mattered and will always matter, which is why the show resonates so deeply with so many people. The craft and care that went into Season 3, from the performances to the writing to the visual effects to the production design, represents a remarkable collective achievement. Television is a collaborative medium, and The Boys is one of the best recent examples of what's possible when talented people work together with genuine ambition and genuine respect for their audience. So let that be where we leave things tonight. The lights are low. The information has settled around you like something soft and familiar. You know a little more now about how one of television's most interesting shows was made and what it was trying to do. And there's nothing left for you to do tonight except let your thoughts grow quieter and your breathing grow slower and let the rest of the night carry you somewhere peaceful. Sleep well. You've earned it. Picture this. You're lying in bed, lights off, maybe a little too tired to watch anything but not quite tired enough to actually fall asleep. Your brain is still buzzing. You need something interesting. Something that pulls you in without demanding too much from you. Something that rewards you for just listening. Well, tonight you are in exactly the right place. Because we are diving deep into one of the most brilliantly written, shockingly creative, and genuinely underrated seasons of television ever made. Season 2 of The Boys. And whether you watched it when it first dropped or you've seen it a dozen times, I promise you there are things about this season that will genuinely surprise you. Details you probably missed. Behind-the-scenes stories that make the whole thing even more impressive. And facts that reveal just how much thought went into every single frame. So get comfortable. Settle in. And let's talk about The Boys Season 2 in a way you've never heard before. Let's start with the thing that makes Season 2 so remarkable compared to its predecessor. When Season 1 dropped, nobody really knew what to expect. The Boys arrived as this loud, irreverent, politically charged antidote to superhero fatigue, and audiences were genuinely shocked by how far it was willing to go. But here's the thing about shock value. It only works once. The second time around, you can't just do the same tricks. You have to evolve. And the creative team behind The Boys understood that completely. Season 2 wasn't just more of the same. It was a deliberate deepening of everything the show was trying to say. The satire got sharper, the characters got more complex, and the storytelling became genuinely layered in ways that rewarded close attention. One of the most fascinating aspects of Season 2 is how it handled the introduction of Stormfront. And let me tell you, the casting of Aya Cash in that role was one of the most inspired decisions the show ever made. Before The Boys, Aya Cash was perhaps best known for her comedic work, and that background turned out to be absolutely crucial to how the character worked. Stormfront is terrifying precisely because she's charming. She's funny. She's relatable. She speaks in this casual, internet-savvy language that makes her feel like someone you might actually follow on social media. And that is the point. The show was using her character to make a very specific and very pointed argument about how modern extremism operates. It doesn't announce itself with a red flag and a manifesto. It comes wrapped in humor and charisma and relatability. The fact that Aya Cash could deliver that performance with such precision while also making it feel completely natural is genuinely extraordinary. Now here's something that might genuinely surprise you. The character of Stormfront in the original comic books is actually a male character. A fairly straightforward neo-Nazi villain without the kind of complexity or social commentary layered into the television version. The decision to reimagine that character as a woman, and specifically to frame her as this social media savvy, image-conscious, deeply manipulative figure, was a creative choice made specifically for the show. And it transformed what could have been a one-note antagonist into something that actually says something real about the world we live in. The showrunners were looking at the rise of online radicalization and the way that certain ideological movements had learned to rebrand themselves using the aesthetics of progressivism and internet culture. Stormfront is the fictional embodiment of that very real phenomenon. Let's talk about Karl Urban for a moment, because Billy Butcher is one of the great performances currently on television, and Season 2 really pushed that character into new territory. What a lot of people don't know is that Karl Urban brings a lot of himself to that role. The physicality, the accent, the sheer intensity of how he inhabits Butcher. There's a rawness to it that doesn't feel entirely performed. Urban has talked about finding the character's anger very accessible because the things Butcher is angry about, the abuse of power, the corruption of institutions, the way ordinary people get ground up by systems designed to protect the powerful, those are things that genuinely resonate with him. Season 2 in particular gave Urban some of the most emotionally demanding material of his entire career, particularly in the scenes involving Butcher's wife Becca and his complicated relationship with her son Ryan. Watching Butcher navigate that relationship is watching a man who has built his entire identity around hatred suddenly confronted with the possibility that love might require something more from him. The character of Ryan, who is Homelander's biological son, is another element that Season 2 uses with remarkable intelligence. Because Ryan is not a villain. He is a child. A deeply confused, genuinely frightened child who has been raised in complete isolation by a mother who is trying to protect him from both Vought and from his own father. The show never lets you forget that. Even as Homelander becomes increasingly unhinged and the threat he represents becomes more acute, Ryan remains this figure of pure innocence caught in the middle. And the way Season 2 explores the idea that children can be either the best or worst thing that happens to someone like Homelander, that his son could either redeem him or destroy whatever was left of his humanity, is genuinely sophisticated storytelling. Speaking of Homelander, Anthony Starr's performance in Season 2 is something that genuinely deserves to be studied. There is a scene in the season where Homelander is alone, standing on a rooftop, and he begins laughing and crying simultaneously in this way that is profoundly disturbing. It communicates everything you need to know about where this character is psychologically without a single word of dialogue. Anthony Starr has spoken about the research he did for the role, looking at how narcissistic personality disorder manifests, how people who have never developed a secure sense of identity behave when that identity is threatened. Season 2 is really where that research pays off most visibly, because the threat to Homelander's identity in this season isn't external. It's internal. He is forced to confront the fact that he might not actually be the good guy he has always needed to believe he was. Now let's talk about something that comes up a lot when people discuss The Boys, and that is the show's relationship to real superhero franchises. The satire is obviously pointed at the MCU and DCU in general terms, but Season 2 gets quite specific. The idea of superheroes being used to justify military intervention, the manipulation of public perception around supers being deployed overseas, the congressional hearings about superhero accountability, all of this is clearly in conversation with real debates that were happening in American political culture at the time. And the show doesn't pretend to be neutral about any of it. The Boys has a point of view, and Season 2 sharpens that point of view considerably. The superheroes in this show are not metaphors for something vague. They are very specific metaphors for corporate power, for the military-industrial complex, for media manipulation, and for the way celebrity culture insulates the powerful from accountability. Here's a fascinating production detail that most viewers have no idea about. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, not in the United States. And yet it needs to convincingly depict New York City, various American small towns, government buildings, and corporate headquarters. The production design team on The Boys is working at an extraordinarily high level to make Toronto stand in for all of these locations, and Season 2 in particular required some incredibly creative problem-solving to pull off certain key sequences. The city of Toronto and its surrounding areas have a remarkable flexibility as a filming location, but matching the specific visual language of New York requires a level of attention to detail that the show's crew has become almost legendary for delivering. Let's shift to talking about Deep, because the arc that Chase Crawford is given in Season 2 is one of the most underrated storytelling choices the entire show has made. Deep was introduced in Season 1 as a fairly simple villain, a harasser who uses his position of power to exploit women and faces no consequences. Season 2 recontextualizes that character in a genuinely unexpected way. It doesn't excuse what he did, not even slightly. But it does explore the psychology of how someone ends up becoming that kind of person. The Church of the Collective subplot, which is clearly modeled on Scientology, is used to examine how predatory organizations exploit people who are already damaged, who are already desperate for belonging and validation. Deep is pathetic in Season 2, and that is precisely the point. The show is asking you to understand him without asking you to forgive him. The Gills scene. If you know, you know. And if you don't know, you're in for quite a surprise. There is a scene in Season 2 involving Deep's Gills that is among the most audacious, genuinely strange pieces of television I've ever encountered. It manages to be simultaneously absurd and emotionally sincere, which is a combination almost no other show has ever successfully achieved. What's remarkable about that scene is that it actually advances the character. It's not shock for shock's sake. The scene is about Deep confronting his own body, his own identity, his own sense of self-worth, through this deeply weird lens. The fact that the writers found a way to use something so bizarre to say something genuine about body image and self-acceptance is a testament to how carefully the show is actually constructed. Now let me tell you something about the writing process for Season 2 that really illuminates why the season feels so cohesive. The writer's room for The Boys operates somewhat differently from many other prestige television shows. Showrunner Eric Kripke, who also created Supernatural, has talked about the importance of having writers in the room who come from very different political and cultural backgrounds. The show doesn't want an echo chamber. It wants genuine debate about what the satire should be targeting, how far to push things, what actually constitutes meaningful commentary versus mere provocation. Season 2 in particular benefited from this approach because it was dealing with subject matter, the rise of white nationalist movements, online radicalization, media complicity and extremism, that required a nuanced and thoughtful approach to avoid either trivializing the issue or becoming preachy about it. Eric Kripke has been remarkably candid in interviews about the fact that the show often writes itself into positions that make him personally uncomfortable. Not because the content is gratuitous, but because the satire forces him to examine things he would rather not examine. The character of Homelander, for example, has become in some corners of the internet a figure of admiration rather than horror. Fans who identify with his worldview, who see his contempt for ordinary people and his rage at those who would constrain him as something aspirational. Kripke has said that this is simultaneously the most disturbing and the most validating response to the show, because it confirms that what they're depicting is real and present in the culture, not something they've invented. Let's talk about the finale of Season 2, because it contains one of the most memorable moments in the show's entire run. The scene where a character's head explodes. I'll try to keep this relatively spoiler-light for anyone who might somehow be hearing this before watching. But that moment is not just a shock gag. It is the culmination of an entire season's worth of thematic work about the limits of corruption, about what happens when systems designed to manage dangerous people fail, and about the way violence has a way of turning back on those who use it as a tool. The visual effects team on that sequence spent an enormous amount of time getting the practicalities right, but more importantly, the writers spent enormous care setting up the emotional and narrative logic that makes the moment land as more than just gross spectacle. Here is something that I find genuinely fascinating about Season 2 from a structural perspective. It is a season about exposure. Almost every major character arc in the season involves some version of a secret being threatened. Vaught's secrets about Compound v Homelander's secret about Becca and Ryan. Stormfront's secret history. The boys own secrets from each other. Even secondary characters like A-Train and Maeve are navigating questions about what happens when the lies they've been living start to unravel. The entire season operates around this central anxiety about revelation, about what it costs to keep things hidden and what it costs when they come to light. And this is not an accident. The theme is consistent from the first episode to the last, woven into every storyline simultaneously. Now here's a behind-the-scenes detail that really changed how I thought about the show. The costume design on the boys is doing things that are easy to miss on a first watch. The soup costumes are designed to look like what a corporate marketing team would create if they were trying to sell heroism as a brand, not to evoke actual functionality or power. The textures, the colors, the little branding details. All of it is designed to read as product first and as superhero costume second. But in Season 2, there's a subtle evolution in some of the costumes that tracks character development. Starlight's costume in particular goes through changes that mirror her psychological journey through the season, her increasing resistance to Vaught's control, her reclamation of her own identity. These changes were entirely intentional. Elizabeth Shue joins the cast in Season 2 as Madeline Stillwell's replacement, and the character of Ashley brings something that the show really needed at that point in its run. A corporate villain who is just trying to survive, who isn't ideologically committed to anything beyond her own advancement, and who therefore represents the most common and perhaps most dangerous kind of complicity. Ashley isn't a true believer. She's just someone who has decided that the cost of resistance is too high. And watching her navigate the impossible demands of managing superheroes who could vaporize her with a look is both terrifying and darkly funny in exactly the right measure. Let me tell you about the music in Season 2, because this is another element that doesn't get nearly enough credit. The show's music supervisor has an almost supernatural ability to find needle-drop moments that recontextualize both the songs and the scenes they're placed in. There is a particular sequence in Season 2 set to a classic piece of music where the juxtaposition between the wholesome familiarity of the song and the absolute carnage unfolding on screen creates this vertiginous feeling that is entirely unique to the boys. The show understands that music is not just mood enhancement. It's commentary. The song choices in the boys are always saying something about the scene they're soundtracking. Something that I want to highlight specifically for anyone who appreciates craft in storytelling is the way Season 2 handles the character of Mother's Milk. Laz Alonso gets some of the best material of his career in this season, and what makes it work is the tension between MM's desperate need for order and control, his meticulous, careful, methodical approach to everything, and the absolute chaos that defines his life as part of the boys. Season 2 gives him a family subplot that grounds all of his psychological quirks in something emotionally real. His obsessive tendencies aren't played for comedy. They're shown as survival mechanisms developed by someone who has been unable to prevent terrible things from happening to people he loves. That's rich, careful character work. Now I want to spend some time on a detail that really reflects the show's commitment to internal consistency. The world of the boys has its own internal logic around how powers work, how Compound V functions, and how the Vought Corporation has structured its entire operation around managing and monetizing these abilities. Season 2 expands this worldview significantly. The congressional hearings about soups, The revelation about Compound V being given to people in other countries, the corporate and political machinery around all of this. It's extraordinarily detailed world building that rewards attention. The show clearly has documents, timelines, and histories for this world that never make it onto screen but that inform every decision the writers make. Here's something that might make you appreciate the show on a different level. The Boys films its more extreme violence and its more provocative content with a deliberate aesthetic that is meant to be uncomfortable rather than exciting. This is an intentional choice. In most action movies and superhero films, violence is choreographed to be cool. The camera angles, the editing rhythms, the sound design all work together to make it feel thrilling. The Boys deliberately subverts this. When violence happens in The Boys, it usually looks wrong. The camera doesn't glorify it. The editing makes it feel sudden and unglamorous. The sound design emphasizes the wet, physical reality of what's happening. This is the show making an argument with its filmmaking language about how we've been trained to consume violence as entertainment. Let's talk about the ending of Season 2 and what it sets up. Without going into too much detail, the season ends with Homelander in a genuinely interesting place. He has not been defeated. In fact, in some ways he has consolidated power. But his psychology has shifted. He has been forced to confront his own vulnerabilities in ways that he has not fully processed. And the dynamic with Ryan represents both his greatest potential weakness and his most dangerous new motivation. Season 3 of The Boys picks up threads from everything Season 2 planted, but the seeds are all right there in the final episodes of the second season if you know what to look for. One thing that often gets overlooked in discussions of The Boys is the performance of Jack Quaid as Huey Campbell. Huey is the audience surrogate character, the everyman who serves as our entry point into this world of superpowered horror. But Jack Quaid finds unexpected depths in what could have been a purely functional role. In Season 2 particularly, Huey goes through a crisis of his own effectiveness. He starts to question whether he is actually useful to the boys or whether he's just tagging along. And the choices he makes as a result of that crisis, some of them very wrong choices, feel earned because of the groundwork Quaid has been laying since episode 1. There's a really interesting piece of trivia about the casting process for The Boys that relates to Season 2 specifically. When they were searching for the right person to play Stormfront, the casting team reportedly went through an extensive search looking for someone who could thread a very specific needle. The character needed to be immediately likable. She needed to have the kind of warmth and charisma that makes you want to trust her. But there also needed to be something just slightly off, just barely perceptible, that a careful viewer might catch on a rewatch. Aya Cash nailed this so completely that several people involved in production have said they occasionally had to remind themselves during filming that the character was the villain. Now here is a piece of context that I think is genuinely important for understanding Season 2 and why it landed the way it did. The season was released in 2020, during an extraordinarily turbulent period in American and global history. The conversations the show was having about extremism, about institutional corruption, about the relationship between media and truth, these were not abstract conversations. They were conversations that were happening in real time, right alongside the show. And the creative team has talked about the strange and sometimes uncomfortable experience of watching their satire feel less like exaggeration and more like documentary as the year unfolded. That context of release doesn't just make the show feel prescient. It helps explain why it resonated so deeply with so many viewers. Let me tell you about the practical effects work in Season 2, because this show uses more practical effects than most people realize. The production takes a hybrid approach, combining CGI with practical elements in ways that keep things grounded. The gore, for instance, is frequently practical. The decision to use real practical effects for many of the show's more extreme physical moments is part of what gives the violence its particular quality of wrongness, that feeling that what you're seeing couldn't quite have been manufactured. There's a texture to practical effects that CGI still struggles to replicate perfectly, and the production designer and special effects coordinator on The Boys have been quite deliberate about preserving that texture. Something worth discussing is how Season 2 handles the representation of trauma, particularly among its female characters. Season 1 was criticized in some quarters for how it depicted sexual violence, with some arguing that it was too explicit, that it was using assault as a plot device rather than engaging meaningfully with its consequences. Season 2 responds to that criticism in interesting ways. The show is more thoughtful about giving its female characters agency in how they process and respond to what has been done to them. Maeve's arc in particular, her refusal to be used as a tool anymore regardless of the personal cost, feels like the show working through and deepening its approach to these themes. The show also does something really interesting with A-Train in Season 2. A-Train is not a sympathetic character. He made a terrible choice in Season 1 and then made it worse with his subsequent choices. But Season 2 gives him a storyline that forces you to hold two things at once simultaneously: his villainy and his victimhood. Because A-Train is also someone who has been exploited, who has been built up and then discarded by Vought, who has had his identity and his community weaponized against him. The show doesn't use this to forgive him, but it does use it to make the world feel more textured and real, because in the real world, people are frequently both. Here's a final behind-the-scenes detail that I love. The script for the season finale was rewritten multiple times right up until filming began, and even after filming began, certain elements were adjusted based on what the cast was bringing to the material. The performers on this show, particularly Anthony Starr and Carl Urban, are doing things with their characters that consistently surprise the writers and push them to find new angles. Television at its best is a collaborative art form, and The Boys Season 2 is a really beautiful example of what happens when you put genuinely talented people in a room together and give them the freedom and the trust to follow the work wherever it leads. What makes The Boys Season 2 ultimately so enduring as a piece of television is that it takes its audience seriously. It doesn't talk down to you. It doesn't pretend the world is simpler than it is. It looks directly at some of the most complicated and uncomfortable aspects of contemporary culture: the way we manufacture heroes, the way we consume outrage, the way power insulates itself from consequence, and it finds a way to make all of that viscerally entertaining without blunting the critique. That combination is extraordinarily rare. Shows that are genuinely funny, genuinely scary, genuinely provocative, and genuinely thoughtful at the same time don't come along very often. And the fact that Season 2 managed to raise the bar set by an already excellent first season is the thing that really cements its legacy. It would have been so easy to simply do more of the same. More blood, more shock, more outrage. But instead, the show chose to do something harder and more interesting. It chose to grow, to complicate, to ask harder questions and resist easier answers. Season 2 is where The Boys became not just a great genre show, but an actually important piece of popular culture. Something that was genuinely in conversation with its moment in a way that very few things achieve. So the next time you're drifting off and you want something interesting to think about, something that rewards the way your brain works when it's just slightly untethered from the demands of full consciousness, think about Stormfront and what she says about how modern extremism sells itself. Think about Homelander crying and laughing on that rooftop and what that tells you about the psychology of people who never learn to be accountable. Think about Butcher standing in the ruins of everything he thought he knew, looking at a little boy he didn't ask for, and choosing to be better than he has any natural inclination to be. The Boys Season 2 is not just great television. It's a mirror. And the thing about mirrors is they show you things you can't see any other way. Sleep well. And maybe when you wake up, watch it again. The most unsettling superhero ever put on screen wasn't created by Marvel or DC. He was raised in a laboratory, never told he was loved, and given the power to destroy everything he touched. The Boys is a show that exists in this fascinating space between satire and genuine emotional storytelling. It takes everything you thought you knew about superheroes and flips it completely upside down. The premise sounds simple on the surface. What if the people with extraordinary powers were not the noble protectors we always imagined them to be? What if instead, they were deeply flawed, psychologically damaged, and in some cases genuinely monstrous? What comes out of that question is one of the richest, most layered television universes ever constructed. Let's start with something that gets overlooked surprisingly often. The show draws heavily from a comic book series that came out in 2006. The original comics were written by Garth Ennis, who is known for being absolutely relentless when it comes to pushing boundaries. The television adaptation keeps the core spirit of that material alive, while also expanding and deepening certain storylines in ways that even fans of the comics found genuinely surprising. The showrunners made a deliberate choice early on to honor what made the source material so powerful, while also making it feel like something fresh and specifically designed for the world we live in right now. One of the most interesting things about the show's main villain, Homelander, is that his psychology is meticulously constructed. Every single thing about him, from his obsessive need for approval to his terrifying outbursts of violence, traces back to a very specific childhood that the show reveals gradually over multiple seasons. He was raised in a laboratory. He never had a parent in any meaningful sense. The people around him during his most formative years treated him as an asset rather than a child. That kind of deprivation creates something almost impossible to repair. The show takes that damage seriously, and what emerges is a character who simultaneously wants to be loved by absolutely everyone and also holds everyone in contempt. That contradiction is what makes him so fascinating to watch. The actor who plays Homelander has spoken in various interviews about how he approaches the role, and one thing that consistently comes up is the idea of playing someone who has no genuine emotional anchoring. Everything Homelander feels is exaggerated, performative, or completely disconnected from reality. When he smiles, it never quite reaches his eyes. When he laughs, there is something hollow underneath it. These are all deliberate choices, and they come through in a way that makes your skin crawl even during moments that should feel lighter. Now here is something truly interesting about the way the show handles its generational trauma theme, because this is one of the most carefully crafted threads running through the entire series. The show essentially argues that trauma does not just affect the person who experienced it. It gets passed down. It mutates. It becomes the lens through which damaged people see the world and eventually the template they use when interacting with others, especially the people closest to them. You see this most clearly in the relationships between fathers and sons. Each generation inherits something broken from the one before, and the tragedy is that even when characters are aware of this cycle, breaking it turns out to be extraordinarily difficult. Soldier Boy is a character who embodies this idea perfectly. He is presented as a kind of golden age hero, the original American superhero, a product of the post-World War II era when America was deeply anxious about its standing in the world and desperately wanted its own myths and legends. The show is very specific about how this character came to exist. After the war, there was this enormous appetite for symbols of American strength and superiority, and a character like Soldier Boy fit perfectly into that cultural moment. He was strong, conventionally handsome in that mid-century movie star way, and he projected an image of uncomplicated patriotic power. But behind that image was someone who carried their own wounds. The show makes clear that Soldier Boy himself had a brutal upbringing, complete with a father who was abusive and cruel. He learned what relationships looked like from someone who treated love as a weapon. And so when he eventually had a son of his own, which he did not even know about for most of his existence, he had no template for anything other than what he had been taught. The cycle continued. Homelander grew up without Soldier Boy, yes, but he still inherited that damage through other means, through the clinical coldness of the laboratory, through the manipulative warmth of people who only cared about controlling him. And then there is Ryan, Homelander's actual biological son, a young boy navigating an almost unimaginably complicated situation. He loves his father. Children often love their parents regardless of what those parents have done, because love and safety feel like the same thing when you are young. But Ryan is also perceptive enough to sense that something is deeply wrong. The show handles this character with real tenderness. He is not simply a prop in the larger story. He is a person trying to figure out who he is while surrounded by adults who all have their own agendas and their own damage. One of the most poignant things about Ryan's storyline in the later seasons is the moment when he discovers that things he believed to be true about his family were not true at all. When a child discovers that the story they were told about their own origins was a lie, something fundamental shifts inside them. The ground under their feet is no longer solid. This is something that real survivors of family dysfunction talk about all the time. The rewriting of your own history is sometimes more traumatic than the original wound, because it means you have to question not just what happened, but what you understood about your own life. Now let's talk about the broader world of the show, because one of its most brilliant achievements is the way it constructs the infrastructure of this universe. Vought International is not just a company. It is a stand-in for every massive corporation that has ever wrapped itself in idealistic language while pursuing fundamentally self-interested goals. The show understands that the most dangerous villains are not the ones who openly announce their cruelty. The most dangerous villains are the ones who have convinced themselves and everyone around them that they are actually the good guys. The character of Stan Edgar is one of the show's most sophisticated creations for exactly this reason. He is not loud. He is not theatrical. He does not give monologues about domination or victory. He is simply a man who understands how power works at a structural level, and he uses that understanding with cold precision. When he says that corporations are the true villains, more dangerous than any individual with superpowers, he is not being ironic. He genuinely believes this because he has spent decades operating within that system and watching it produce results that individual violence never could. There is a speech in the later season that captures something genuinely important about how systems of power perpetuate themselves. The argument goes something like this. You can remove a person from power. You can expose them. You can even destroy them. But the structure that made them powerful, the institutions, the money, the cultural mythology built around their image, that structure persists. It finds a new vessel. It adapts. This is not a cynical or hopeless observation. It is actually a call to think about change at a deeper level, to address the roots rather than just the visible branches. The science fiction elements of the show, particularly the substance called Compound V, are used to explore questions about pharmaceutical power, about what happens when profit and human experimentation intersect without sufficient oversight. The show draws explicit parallels to real historical atrocities, moments when human beings were treated as experimental subjects by institutions that had convinced themselves the ends justified the means. These are not comfortable parallels, and they are not meant to be. Friedrich Vought, the fictional scientist whose legacy haunts the entire show, is clearly modeled on the very real phenomenon of Nazi scientists who were recruited by the United States government after World War II through a program historically known as Operation Paperclip. The show does not shy away from what this means. If the foundation of your entire superhero industry was built on atrocity, if the very substance that creates these powerful beings was developed through the torture and murder of innocent people, then everything built on top of that foundation carries that weight. Every superhero in the show, whether they know it or not, is connected to that original violence. One of the recurring visual and thematic motifs of the show is the contrast between what things look like on the surface and what they actually are underneath. The Seven, the show's central superhero team, exists primarily as a marketing product. Their public appearances are managed by publicists. Their relationships are manufactured for media consumption. Their personalities are packaged and sold. The show draws this out in a way that feels uncomfortably familiar given how celebrity culture actually functions in the real world. Starlight is interesting precisely because she starts out genuinely believing in the mission. She grew up with authentic faith in superheroes as symbols of hope and protection. When she discovers what the reality of being a corporate superhero actually looks like, the disillusionment she experiences is written all over her face in every scene. She does not immediately become cynical. She does not flip into pure pragmatism. She struggles. She tries to reconcile what she believed with what she is learning. That struggle is one of the most human things in the show. Huey, her partner, has his own version of this journey. He enters the story as someone who has experienced the direct violence of superhero recklessness, someone who lost someone he loved to a casual accident that a superhero did not even bother to pause for. His anger is righteous. His desire for accountability is completely understandable. But the show is also honest about how anger, even righteous anger, can become its own kind of trap if you are not careful with it. Huey spends much of the series learning to be dangerous without becoming what he hates. Butcher is probably the most complicated character in the show's ensemble. He has all the qualities that genre fiction likes to give its anti-heroes. He is ruthless and intelligent. He is capable of extraordinary violence when the situation demands it. He is also genuinely committed to a cause he believes in deeply. But the show refuses to let him be simply cool or simply tragic. It insists on showing you the actual cost of the choices he makes. When Butcher hurts someone, when he lies or manipulates or destroys something in the service of his mission, there are consequences that ripple outward. People suffer. Trust is broken. The people who believed in him have to decide what to do with that information. His relationship with Ryan is one of the most emotionally loaded in the entire series. On one level, Butcher sees Ryan as a threat, as a potential Homelander in the making, a child with devastating power and uncertain moral development. On another level, Ryan represents something Butcher has lost and can never recover. There is a complicated protective instinct that lives inside his hostility, and the show gives you enough glimpses of it to understand that even this most guarded and destructive character carries something tender underneath all the damage. The world building in the show extends into some genuinely fascinating territory when it explores the religious dimension of superhero worship. There is something the show keeps circling back to, which is the idea that in a world where people with godlike power actually exist and are publicly visible, the human impulse toward religious devotion does not disappear. It just finds a new object. Homelander understands this on some instinctive level, and in the later seasons he begins actively cultivating it. He does not just want to be admired. He wants to be worshipped. He wants the kind of unconditional devotion that does not ask questions, that does not require accountability, that simply surrenders. The show makes this critique of authoritarian movements very carefully and very specifically. The rallies, the iconography, the way dissent is treated as betrayal, the way followers are encouraged to define themselves entirely in opposition to imagined enemies. These are not abstract warnings. They are drawn from very specific historical and contemporary sources. The writers have been thoughtful about not making this a partisan thing in the simplest sense. The critique is broader than that. It is about how charismatic authority figures exploit the genuine human need for belonging and meaning. The Deep is one of the show's most unexpected emotional landscapes. He starts out as a figure of somewhat grotesque satire, a powerful figure who abuses his position and then faces consequences he considers unfair. But somewhere along the way, the show found something genuinely pathetic and almost sympathetic in him. He is someone who has never developed any meaningful inner life. He defines himself entirely through status and through what others think of him. When that external validation is taken away, there is nothing underneath. No actual self to fall back on. His relationship with aquatic life becomes the one place where he experiences something close to genuine feeling, and the show plays this for dark comedy while also letting it be genuinely sad. Mother's Milk is the character who perhaps best represents the show's argument about how ordinary people find the courage to resist systems that feel too large and too powerful to challenge. He is not someone who wants to be a hero. He has a family he loves. He has a normal life that he wants to return to. But he also has a history with Vought that made turning away impossible. His commitment is not abstract. It is not ideological in the airy sense. It is personal and specific and rooted in actual loss. That is what makes him believable as someone who keeps going even when the situation seems completely hopeless. Frenchie and Kimiko as a pair explore something the show does surprisingly tenderly, which is the question of what a meaningful life looks like for people who have been shaped by violence. Kimiko was turned into a weapon. She did not choose her power. She did not choose the world she was pulled into. What she wants, with a clarity that cuts right through all the chaos around her, is something quiet. She wants connection. She wants a future that belongs to her rather than to the emergency she was drafted into. Whether or not she gets that future is something the show holds in careful suspension. The spin-off elements that the show has begun to develop point toward an even more elaborate universe, one that stretches back through decades of American history. The idea of exploring the origins of Vought in the post-war period, of seeing how the superhero mythology was constructed from the ground up during the Cold War era of anxiety and ambition, is genuinely exciting from a storytelling perspective. The show has always been interested in history, in how the present is shaped by things that happened before any of the current characters were born. Expanding backward into that territory gives the mythology more texture and more weight. One of the most technically impressive things about the show is how it manages tonal shifts. In a single episode, you can move from something absolutely grotesque and shocking to something quietly heartbreaking to something genuinely funny and then back again. This should not work. Shows that try to cover that much tonal ground usually end up feeling incoherent or manipulative. But the writing and direction maintain such clear control of the emotional logic that each shift feels earned rather than jarring. You understand why this moment follows that moment even when the surface texture feels completely different. The music choices throughout the series deserve their own mention. There is a particular joy in how the show places classic rock and pop songs in completely unexpected contexts, letting the familiar sounds of beloved music become strange and sometimes sinister when attached to images that recontextualize them entirely. This is a technique with a long history in film and television, but the show uses it with particular wit and precision. As you drift towards sleep, carry with you the idea at the heart of all of this storytelling. Power does not corrupt in a simple mechanical way. What power does is reveal. It takes what is already inside a person and removes the normal social pressures that keep it hidden. The kindness that a genuinely kind person carries comes out more freely when they have power. The cruelty that a cruel person has been managing comes out too. The world the show builds is not a world where extraordinary people are simply bad. It is a world where extraordinary power applied to ordinary human damage produces consequences that ordinary human communities struggle to contain. The most hopeful thing about it is that even in that world, people keep trying. They keep reaching toward each other. They keep believing that something better is possible. And that, in the end, is worth dreaming about.